sand everyone said was worth less than the mud beneath it. She knelt in the frost and touched it with 2 fingers. Somewhere far below, water moved. She was 19 years old and had nothing. That is where the story truly begins. Not at the well, not at the farm, but in a cold room above a laundry in Silver Creek, Montana, where Willa Ashford woke each morning to the same arithmetic. Work more, earn less, disappear quietly into a life that asked nothing of her, because it expected nothing from her. Some people inherit land. Willa had inherited only the talent for enduring. Silver Creek in late January was the color of old pewter.
I'm trying,
The mountains
but
held
the
their
machine is
snow and the town
difficult.
held
Trying
its
isn't
needs.
enough when there's
And
this
Willa
much
moved
work.
through both
Now hurry
with
it
the practiced
along.
invisibility of someone who had learned that drawing attention to yourself only invited someone to remind you of your place. Her place, as anyone in town could tell you, was nowhere in particular. She worked 6 days a week at Mrs. Cordelia Pruitt's laundry feeding linens through a hand-cranked wringer until her shoulders ached down to the bone. She lived in a single rented room, a low-ceilinged closet, really, with a nail for her coat and a washstand she shared with 2 other women on the same floor. She ate what was cheap and slept when she could, and saved coins in a cracked canning jar that never seemed to fill no matter how carefully she counted. She had no parents living. Her mother had died of fever when Willa was 11. Her father 2 years before that, in a sawmill accident that the company had paid $3 to settle and considered closed. She had no aunts or uncles nearby, no cousins she knew well, no sweetheart, no prospects. What she did have, the one good thing, was her grandfather, Silas Ashford, who lived alone on a piece of land out in Black Pine Valley and wrote her letters in a cramped, careful hand every few weeks. The letters were never long. Silas was not a man who wasted words, but they were always warm, and they always ended the same way. Keep your eyes open, Willa girl. The world hides more than it shows. She had smiled at that once when she was younger. Lately, it had begun to feel like something other than comfort, like instruction. He died on the 4th of January, quietly in his sleep, the way good men sometimes are allowed to go. A neighbor found him and sent word to Silver Creek. Willa borrowed a black ribbon for her hair, said a private prayer in her cold little room, and went back to work the next morning because there was nothing else to do. She did not yet know he had left her anything. The letter came 3 weeks after the funeral, delivered by a boy from the land office who looked embarrassed to be handing it over. It was from a county clerk in Deaver, 1 town east, and it informed Willa in dry legal language that one Silas Ashford had recorded her name as sole heir to the property at Black Pine Valley. 40 acres of barn, a stone well, and a collapsed outbuilding assessed at minimal value. Tucked inside the official envelope was a second, smaller envelope in her grandfather's handwriting. She recognized the cramped letters immediately. Willa girl. It began, don't let them tell you what something is worth before you've looked at it yourself. Come to the farm. Look at the well first. Look carefully. Love, grandfather. She read the letter 4 times that evening, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, with the canning jar of coins on the washstand beside her. Then she folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and stared at the wall. 40 acres in Black Pine Valley. She knew the place, or knew of it. She had visited twice as a small child and remembered almost nothing except the smell of pine resin and the way the valley sat in a long shadow most of the afternoon. The farm had stood empty for nearly a decade. People in Silver Creek occasionally mentioned it the way you mention a tooth that had been pulled briefly with a slight wince, and then not again. Abandoned, frosted over, half-fallen, worthless. Mrs. Pruitt had an opinion on the matter offered, without being asked when Willa mentioned it at work the next morning. "That valley land is good for nothing," Mrs. Pruitt said, not looking up from her ledger. "Hard winter, bad soil, no neighbors. Your grandfather was a sweet old man, but he was no farmer. You'd be a fool to chase after a ruin." Willa said nothing. She fed another sheet through the wringer, but the letter sat in her coat pocket all day, and she touched it a dozen times without meaning to. What was she holding on to here, really? The farm was almost certainly a disappointment. A collection of fallen boards and frozen mud, and a well that had probably gone dry before she was born. She had no horse, no wagon, barely enough saved to cover the mail coach fare to Deaver and back. She couldn't afford to lose a week's wages on a hope that turned out to be nothing. And yet, look at the well first. Look carefully. Not there's money buried there. Not the land is valuable. Just look carefully. Her grandfather had never once told her to look at something carelessly. He had taught her to read animal tracks in soft ground, to tell which way water ran by the tilt of moss on stones. He was precise about looking. She put the canning jar in her coat pocket alongside the letter. It was not enough. It might be exactly enough. By Thursday morning, she had arranged for her absence. She left on the Friday mail coach before dawn, with her grandfather's letter in her breast pocket. A canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision and stopped arguing with it. The other passengers were a cattle broker and a sleeping woman wrapped in a wool blanket. Willa watched the dark shapes of pines pass the window and felt for the first time in longer than she could name, not peaceful, exactly, but pointed. She was aimed at something. Whatever waited in Black Pine Valley, she was going toward it with both eyes open the way her grandfather had taught her. The valley announced itself from a distance. A long, dark cleft in the mountain wall that ran east to west and caught the afternoon light at an angle that made the snow on the upper ridges burn white against the blue. The mail coach left her at the crossroads with her canvas bag and a nod from the driver. The walk to the property was 2 miles, and she made it in silence, watching her breath fog in the cold air, watching the road narrow to a track and then to nothing at all. The farm announced its failure from 100 yards out. The outbuilding had indeed collapsed. One wall caved fully inward, the roof laid over it like a tired elbow. The barn still stood, but its boards had gone silver gray with weather, and 2 of its upper planks had sprung loose and hung at angles. The yard was frost-hardened mud and sparse dead grass, and the cold came down the valley in long level sweeps that found every gap in Willa's coat. She stood at the edge of the property for a moment, letting herself feel the disappointment fully, because she had learned from experience that swallowed disappointment came back up later harder. Then she picked up her canvas bag and walked forward. She was here. She would look. It was February 1st, 1884. The sun was a pale disk behind thin clouds. The air smelled of pine and cold stone, and the particular emptiness of a place that has not heard human voices in a long time. The barn first, because it was the largest structure, and because the door was still on its hinges, which felt like a small mercy. Inside, dim light through the sprung planks, a smell of old hay and mouse, a rusted pitchfork leaning against one wall, a few iron hooks, a milking stool with one leg cracked. Nothing remarkable. She moved through it slowly and methodically, running her hand along the walls, checking the floor for rot or softness. The floor was solid. The walls beneath their gray surface were sturdy. Someone had built this barn to last. The collapsed outbuilding held nothing salvageable she could see. She noted it and moved on. The yard was mostly what she had expected. Bare and frozen, and in need of considerable work come spring if she could afford to do anything with the soil at all. She paced the perimeter, getting a sense of the dimensions. 40 acres was more land than it sounded when you stood in the middle of it. The valley wall rose dark with fir on the eastern side, and a shallow creek ran along the northern edge, still half-iced but running. That was worth something at least. And then there was the well. It stood in the center of the yard, built from rough-cut granite. The kind of patient stonework you could only do if you were not in a hurry. Each course laid level and dressed smooth on the interior face. The frame above it was old, weathered darker than the barn boards, and the crossbeam had a crack running through it that had been there long enough to gray over. Ordinary expected except for the rope. She stopped 2 feet from the well and studied it the way her grandfather had taught her to study anything without assumption from the outside in. The rope was new, not merely newer than the frame knew. Clean hemp tightly laid, the fibers still showing their pale color, barely weathered. Someone had replaced this rope within the last year. Her grandfather had replaced this rope within the last year, which meant he had used this well within the last year, which meant there was water here. She looked down. The shaft was dry stone for the first 4 feet, then dropped into darkness. The smell that rose from it was not the flat mineral smell of a dry shaft. It was cool moving air with something living in it. Damp rock and green things and faintly running water. Willa stood up straight. She looked at the stonework again this time, not at the rope but at the stones themselves. They were well fitted and tightly mortared except for one course about knee-height on the eastern side, where the mortar was noticeably lighter in color, newer. She crouched and ran her finger along the seam. Fresh work within the last few years at most. And there on the capstone of the second course, small cut deliberately with a sharp tool worn smooth enough to feel old, but still legible. A double loop like 2 joined circles. The same mark her grandfather used to seal his letters. Willa sat back on her heels in the frozen mud and looked at the mark for a long time. Then she started to pull on the rope. The rope did not draw water. It ran down past the first darkness of the shaft, and then as Willa's eyes adjusted, she saw that it ran at an angle not straight down to a water table, but diagonally along the interior of the shaft wall attached at the bottom to something she could not see from above. She pulled it slowly hand over hand, testing the weight at the other end. It was not a bucket. It was heavier and the weight moved differently, not swinging with the play of a rope on water, but shifting with a dull mechanical deliberateness. She heard wood sliding against stone. She let the rope back down and leaned further over the rim, letting her eyes fully adjust. On the eastern side of the shaft, where the newer mortar was, the wall was not a wall. It was a door low-fitted into the stone with iron hinges set flush with the surface latched from below. The rope ran through a hole in its center. and attached to a wooden lift plate on the other side, a counterweighted shelf she realized designed to descend when you lowered the rope and rise when you drew it up. A goods lift, small and efficient, built right into the shaft wall. Her grandfather had not been hiding money. He had been hiding a way in. She found the access point after another 15 minutes of searching a stone slab on the eastern side of the well frame, just inside a low ring of granite that she had taken for a drainage lip. It was recessed, not mortared, and when she worked her fingers under its edge and lifted it, rose smoothly on a counterweighted hinge of its own, exposing a passage wide enough to take a person sideways with stone steps, cut directly into the earth, descending at a gentle angle into warm darkness below. Warm darkness. She felt it on her face before she saw anything. The air that came up from the passage was distinctly warmer than the February cold above, and it carried that same smell she had noticed in the shaft. Damp rock-green water, living earth. She took her lantern from her bag, lit it, and went down. The staircase descended 12 steps and turned a corner, and then opened into a space that stopped her cold at the threshold. It was a room, a large one, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose 8 feet at the center and curved down toward the edges in a way that made the space feel like the inside of something deliberate and safe. The walls were rough limestone, but the floor was planked wide pine boards fitted close, and even just slightly dusty but not rotted. There were shelves along 3 walls, built in tiers, solid and square, stocked with rows of sealed crocks and labeled tins and folded cloth and bundled tools. An iron hearth sat against the far wall, its pipe running up through the rock in a shaft she hadn't noticed above. And in the corner, tucked back in private, was a small cabin. A room within the room, its walls made of milled timber, its door fitted with a proper iron latch, a quilted curtain hanging in its single small window. Willa stood in the entrance and did not move for a full minute. She could hear the water now. Behind the cabin, a narrow channel in the rock floor carried clear water from a crack in the limestone wall, a spring she realized that fed down and away through a drainage cut in the boards. The sound of it was small and constant and deeply calming, like something that had been running patiently for years, waiting for someone to hear it. On the nearest shelf, propped against a tin of lamp oil, was an envelope. Her name on the front. Her grandfather's hand. She crossed the room in 3 steps, picked it up and pressed it once against her chest before she opened it. Her hands were not quite steady. "Welcome home, Willa girl," it began. She read the letter standing up because she forgot to sit down. It was 2 pages written small. He explained everything, the years of work, the reason for the secrecy, the way the spring had shown itself to him 40 years ago, when he was digging a root cellar that went deeper than planned. He had built the refuge slowly. He rode over every quiet winter since, not for himself, for someone who would need it more. "I could not give you a start in the world the easy way," the letter said. "So I built you one underground and hoped you'd be brave enough to find it." She was. Willa set the letter down on the shelf with care and turned to look at the room again. This time not with shock, but with understanding. Every detail spoke of patience. Every shelf spoke of years. Every fitted board and mortared stone spoke of a man who had worked in the dark and in the quiet, and without anyone's knowledge or approval, building something that would outlast him. The shelves were astonishing. Her grandfather had stocked them over what must have been decades of deliberate accumulation. There were sealed crocks of dried beans, lentils, oats, and cornmeal marked with the year of packing in his neat hand, the oldest from 1871, the newest from 1883, the year before he died. There were tins of lamp oil boxes of friction matches wrapped in oilcloth, folded blankets of heavy wool, a set of cast-iron cookware nested together and packed in cloth. There were tools, a hand plane, 2 chisels, a wooden mallet, a small awl, a folding rule, a coil of fine wire. There was a leather satchel, and inside the satchel, paper-wrapped packets of seeds, labeled in the same careful hand onion turnip, squash lettuce, hardy rye. Each section of shelving had a small card tacked above it, handwritten. Grain and pulse rotate oldest first, do not open crocks in damp. Tools oiled last September, oil again at first use. Seeds viable 3 years, plant rye, first others after last frost. She went through each section, slowly making a mental inventory, occasionally reading a card aloud in the quiet of the refuge, as though her grandfather were still there, and she were reporting back. The small cabin inside the refuge, her sleeping place, she had decided was fitted with a narrow bed frame, a straw mattress in reasonable condition, and a folded quilt that smelled of cedar and dry lavender. On the small shelf above the bed was a tin cup, a stub of candle, and a book, a well-worn copy of a farming almanac from 1879, with certain pages marked by strips of folded paper and annotated in the margins. She picked it up and read one of the margin notes. Willa spring planting in this valley runs 2 weeks later than the almanac advises. Don't be impatient. She laughed alone in the underground cabin at her dead grandfather's advice about impatience. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. The practical reality of her situation was also becoming clearer, and it was not entirely simple. The refuge was extraordinary, but it was not a finished life. It was a beginning. She had supplies for months' shelter against any Montana winter water and warmth. What she did not yet have was a working surface above ground. The barn needed repair before she could use it as a proper work structure. The yard would need to be broken up and turned before the seeds were any use. She had no livestock. She had no neighbors close enough to trade with easily. And there was the matter of her job in Silver Creek. She had taken a week's absence, not a permanent one. At the end of that week, if she did not return, she would have no wages coming in. She sat on the edge of the underground bed and held the almanac and thought through the numbers carefully. They did not add up yet, but they were beginning to point in a direction. On the top shelf, tucked back where it would not be immediately visible, was a small metal box, perhaps 8 inches long and 5 inches wide, with a brass lock. She reached for it and found it heavier than expected. She shook it gently. Something inside shifted. Not coins, something that moved with a dull weight like papers or small tools. She tried the lock. It held. She set the box down and looked around for a key. There was none on the shelf, none on the hearth, none in the cabin. She picked up her grandfather's letter again and read it through a second time, looking for any mention of the box or a key. There was nothing. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket alongside the first one. Whatever was in the box, her grandfather had wanted it secured. She would find the key when she was meant to find it, or she would not find it at all. She spent the night there in the small cabin under the cedar quilt, listening to the spring run and the wind move over the valley above. She did not sleep well. The bed was unfamiliar, the sounds were new, and her mind would not settle. But she did not regret being there. In the morning, she climbed to the surface and stood in the cold dawn light and made her decision. She would go back to Silver Creek one last time. She would collect her things, give her notice, and say her goodbyes such as they were. And then she would return to Black Pine Valley and begin the work of earning what her grandfather had given her. She walked the 2 miles to the crossroads and waited for the mail coach in the cold. When it came, she climbed aboard and sat in silence as the valley disappeared behind her. The return to Silver Creek took 3 hours by mail coach, and Willa spent them in silence watching the landscape reverse itself, watching the valley disappear behind the mountain wall and the town emerge from the gray distance like something inevitable. She had left the refuge at dawn on the 2nd of February with a clarity she had not possessed before. The refuge was real. The land was hers. What remained was the question of what she could do with it, and how long it would take, and whether she had the strength to do it alone. The answers to those questions, she suspected, were going to be harder than the discovery itself. Mrs. Pruitt was not pleased. Willa found her in the back room of the laundry sorting linens into piles for washing her hands red from the cold water, and her face set in the permanent expression of someone who had learned to expect disappointment and was rarely proven wrong. "You're back," Mrs. Pruitt said, not looking up. "I didn't think you would be." "I came to give notice," Willa said. Mrs. Pruitt stopped sorting and looked at her for the first time. "Notice?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm staying at the Valley Farm. I won't be returning to work here." There was a long silence. Mrs. Pruitt set down the sheet she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. "You're a fool," she said, and there was no anger in it, only certainty. "That land will break you. It broke your grandfather, and he was twice the person you are." Willa said nothing. There was nothing to say that would change Mrs. Pruitt's mind, and she had learned long ago that arguing with certainty was a waste of breath. "I'll work through the end of the week," Willa said, "to give you time to find someone else." Mrs. Pruitt shook her head. "Don't bother. If you're going, go now. I don't need someone here whose mind is already somewhere else." It was not kindness, but it was permission, and Willa took it. She collected her few belongings from the room above the laundry. A spare dress, a shawl, a wooden comb, a small Bible her mother had given her. Everything fit in the canvas bag she had brought with her. She left the key on the washstand and walked down the stairs and out into the cold without looking back. By evening, she was on the mail coach again, heading east toward Black Pine Valley. And by the time the sun set behind the mountains, she was standing in the yard of the farm with her bag at her feet and the wind in her face and the absolute certainty that she had just severed the last thread connecting her to the life she had known. There was no going back now. There was only forward. The next 5 days were a lesson in humility. Willa moved into the refuge, completely bringing her bag down the stone steps and setting up a small corner of the cabin as her own. She slept under the cedar quilt and woke to the sound of the spring running and spent her days trying to understand the full scope of what her grandfather had left her. The barn was the immediate problem. Two of the upper planks had sprung loose, allowing water to seep in over what must have been several seasons. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was worsening, and if she did not address it soon, the entire corner would rot through. She stood in the barn and looked up at the gap where the planks had pulled away from the frame. She could see daylight through it, and when the wind blew, she could feel the cold air cutting through. To fix it, she would need to climb up to the roof line, pull the old planks free, fit new ones in their place, and nail them down. She would need someone to hold the planks in position while she worked, because the boards were long and heavy and would not stay in place on their own. She did not have a ladder. She did not have a second person. She had herself and a collection of tools she barely knew how to use. She sat on the milking stool with the cracked leg and put her head in her hands and allowed herself 5 minutes of despair. Then she stood up and went back to work. The yard needed attention. She could do that much alone. She walked the perimeter of the property looking for areas where the soil might be workable, where the frost had not gone too deep, where she could begin preparing the ground for planting when the time came. The almanac said to plant rye first, and to plant it early as soon as the ground could be worked. Rye was hardy, her grandfather had written in the margins. It would tolerate cold soil and uncertain weather. It would give her a first crop, something to build on. She found a stretch along the creek bank where the soil looked darker, richer, less frozen than the rest. She knelt and dug her fingers into it and felt the cold clay yield slightly under pressure. Not ready yet, but close. She marked the spot in her mind and moved on. By the evening of the 6th day, she had a clear picture of her situation, and it was not encouraging. She had shelter and supplies. She had land and water and the beginnings of a plan. What she did not have was the ability to execute that plan alone, and she did not have the money to hire help, and she did not have the time to learn everything she needed to learn before the planting season passed her by. She sat in the refuge that night with the almanac open in front of her and a stub of pencil in her hand, and tried to write out a list of what she needed. Help with the barn. Someone who knew carpentry, or at least someone strong enough to hold boards while she nailed them. Knowledge about planting. She could read the almanac, but reading was not the same as doing, and she had no experience with soil or seeds or the rhythms of a growing season. Time. The planting window was narrow. If she missed it, she would have no crop. And if she had no crop, she would have no way to extend her supplies beyond the winter. Money. She had none. The coins in the canning jar had paid for the mail coach and little else. She set the pencil down and closed the almanac and sat in the quiet for a long time. Her grandfather had done this alone. He had built the refuge alone over 40 years without help and without complaint. He had learned the land and the seasons and the patient work of accumulation, and he had done it in secret in the dark, with no one to see or acknowledge or approve. If he could do that, she could do this, but she would need to ask for help. That was the part that stuck in her throat. She had spent her entire life not asking, not expecting, not imposing. It was a habit that had kept her safe, and it was also a habit that had kept her small. She thought of her grandfather's final letter. He had mentioned a neighbor, someone who knew about the property, someone who had agreed to help whoever came to claim it. She had not followed up on that. She had not wanted to seem weak or incapable or in need, but she was in need. That was the truth. And pretending otherwise was not gonna fix the barn, or plant the rye, or buy her the time she needed. She went to sleep that night with the decision made, and in the morning she walked east along the valley road toward the neighbor her grandfather had trusted. His name was Tobias Brennan, and he lived 2 miles from the farm in a small house with a barn and a feed operation that served the scattered ranches in the area. Willa had never met him, but her grandfather had mentioned him in passing in one of his letters years ago. A decent man, he had written, keeps to himself but fair in his dealings. She found him in the barn stacking sacks of grain onto a flat wagon. He was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered with gray in his beard, and the kind of steady, unhurried movements that suggested he had done this work 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. He looked up when she approached and set down the sack he was holding. "You're Silas Ashford's granddaughter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Willa Ashford." He nodded. "I heard you'd come to claim the property. I was wondering if you'd stay." "I'm staying," Willa said. "Good." He picked up another sack and loaded it onto the wagon. "Your grandfather was a private man, but he was deliberate. Everything he did on purpose." Willa waited. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Tobias set down the sack and looked at her directly. "He asked me to look after the place after he was gone, to help whoever came to claim it. I agreed." "I need help," Willa said. The words came out harder than she intended, but they came out, and that was what mattered. Tobias nodded again. "I figured you might. What do you need?" She told him about the barn, about the roof and the planks, and the corner that was rotting through. She told him she could not fix it alone, and she could not afford to hire someone, and she did not know what to offer in exchange for his time. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I can help with the barn," he said, "but I'm stretched thin right now. My son's working in Butte for the winter, and I'm managing the feed operation and 2 rental properties on my own. I can't get to it for a few weeks." A few weeks. She did not have a few weeks. She needed to start planning soon, and she needed the barn functional before she could store anything or keep livestock, or do any of the work that would make the farm viable. "I can work for you," Willa said, "at the feed operation, in exchange for your help when you're free." Tobias considered this. "You know anything about feed?" "No, sir. But I'm strong and I learn fast." He smiled slightly, the first break in his serious expression. "You sound like your grandfather. He said the same thing when he first came to the valley. Didn't know a damn thing about farming, but he learned." He picked up another sack. "All right. You can work mornings here and I'll pay you a small wage. When I've got time, I'll help with the barn. Fair." "More than fair," Willa said. "Start tomorrow," Tobias said. 6 in the morning, don't be late." She wasn't. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that was as punishing as it was necessary. Willa woke before dawn in the refuge, climbed the stone steps into the cold, and walked the 2 miles to Tobias Brennan's feed operation. She worked from 6 in the morning until noon, stacking grain sacks, sweeping the loading dock, helping with inventory, learning the names of different feeds and the weights and measures that governed the business. The work was hard, but it was simple, and there was a satisfaction in it that she had not expected. The grain sacks were heavy 50 pounds each, and by the end of the first day, her shoulders ached in a way that reminded her of the laundry, but worse. By the end of the first week, the ache had settled into a dull background presence that she barely noticed. Tobias paid her at the end of each day a few coins that she saved carefully, adding them to the small reserve she had brought from Silver Creek. It was not much, but it was something. And something was more than nothing. In the afternoons, she returned to the valley and worked on the farm. She cleared debris from the yard. She walked the creek bank and marked the areas where the soil looked promising. She studied the almanac every evening and made notes in the margins, adding her own observations to her grandfather's, trying to learn the land the way he had learned it. She did not see much of Tobias beyond the mornings at the feed operation, but she saw his daughter Mabel, a girl of 13 with sharp eyes and a quiet competence that reminded Willa of herself at that age. Mabel helped in the feed store sometimes, and she watched Willa work with the kind of curious attention that suggested she was deciding whether Willa was worth knowing. On the 9th of February, 8 days after her arrival at the farm, Willa planted the rye. It was too early by most standards. The ground was still cold and the risk of a late frost was real. But the almanac said rye was hardy, and her grandfather's notes said to plant it first, and she trusted his judgment more than her own fear. She worked the soil along the creek bank with a hoe she had found in the barn, breaking up the frost-hardened clay, turning it over, making it ready. The work was slow and methodical, and her hands blistered within the first hour, but she kept going. When the soil was ready, she opened the packet of rye seeds her grandfather had left in the leather satchel and scattered them in rows, pressing them into the earth with her fingers covering them lightly with soil. It took her the better part of the afternoon to plant the small section she had marked out, and when she finished, her back ached, and her hands were raw, and she had no idea if she had done it correctly. But the seeds were in the ground. That was something. She stood at the edge of the field and looked at the dark soil and the faint lines where she had planted the rows, and she allowed herself a small moment of pride. This was hers. This was the beginning. The people in Silver Creek had opinions about Willa's decision, and they were not shy about sharing them. She heard the talk secondhand through Tobias, who heard it from customers at the feed store. The Ashford girl, they called her. The one who thought she could make a go of that valley land. The one who didn't know better. She'll be gone by spring, one rancher said loud enough for Tobias to hear. That land's no good. Silas Ashford wasted his life on it, and she'll waste hers too. What does a girl know about farming? Another said. She's worked in a laundry her whole life. She'll plant the wrong things at the wrong time and wonder why nothing grows. Tobias did not repeat these comments to Willa directly, but she could see them in his face when she arrived for work in the mornings, in the way he looked at her as though measuring her resolve against the weight of other people's doubt. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Let them talk. She had work to do. On the 16th of February, 15 days after her arrival, the weather turned. It started as a shift in the wind, a change in the smell of the air. Willa noticed it in the afternoon when she returned from Tobias's feed store. The sky was darker than it should have been for midday, and the clouds were low and heavy, moving fast across the valley. By evening, the wind had picked up, and by nightfall, the storm had arrived. It was not snow, which would have been normal for February in Montana. It was rain, cold and relentless, driven sideways by the wind. The kind of early spring storm that arrives too soon and stays too long. Willa was underground when it started, sitting at the small table in the refuge, with the almanac open in front of her. And she heard the rain before she felt it. A distant drumming sound that grew louder as the storm intensified. She climbed the stone steps and pushed open the slab and emerged into the yard. The rain hit her immediately, cold and sharp, soaking through her coat in seconds. She could barely see the barn through the downpour. She retreated underground and sealed the entrance and sat in the refuge, listening to the storm overhead. It rained through the night and into the next day. The sound was constant, a low roar that filled the valley and made it impossible to think about anything else. Willa stayed underground, pacing the chamber, checking the supplies, reading the almanac, trying to keep herself occupied. But her attention kept returning to the spring channel, to the water running through the narrow trough in the rock floor. The flow had increased. She noticed it first as a change in the sound, a louder rush of water over the limestone. Then she noticed the level rising, the water climbing higher in the channel, closer to the edges of the trough. She knelt beside it and watched the water move. It was still clear, still cold, but there was more of it, much more, and it was coming faster. The refuge had been built to handle this. She knew that. Her grandfather would not have spent 40 years building something that could not withstand a storm. But the water kept rising. By midday, the channel was full to the top of the trough, and the overflow was beginning to spill onto the plank floor. Willa stood and looked at the drainage cut at the far end of the chamber, where the water was supposed to exit. The cut was there, she could see it, but the water was not draining as fast as it was arriving. She grabbed the lantern and walked to the far end of the chamber, kneeling beside the drainage cut. The opening was small, perhaps 4 inches wide, and it ran under the planks and down through the rock, carrying the water away to some underground channel she could not see. The problem was immediately obvious. The opening was partially blocked, clogged with sediment and small debris that had accumulated over time. She reached into the opening and pulled out a handful of wet leaves and mud. The water flow increased slightly, but not enough. There was more blockage deeper in beyond where her hand could reach. She stood and looked around the chamber. On the tool shelf, she found the awl and the coil of fine wire her grandfather had left. She took both and returned to the drainage cut. She fed the wire into the opening, working it carefully past the blockage, feeling for the resistance. When she found it, she used the awl to break up the sediment, pushing and scraping and clearing the passage inch by inch. The work was slow and awkward. Her hands were wet and cold, and the wire kept slipping, and she could not see what she was doing, only feel it. But gradually, the blockage gave way. She felt the resistance ease, and then the water began to flow more freely, draining from the channel, pulling the level down. She kept working until the drainage was clear, until the water was flowing smoothly through the cut, and the level in the channel had dropped back to normal. Then she sat back on the wet floor and let herself breathe. The refuge was safe. The system had worked just as her grandfather had designed it to work. All she had to do was maintain it, to pay attention to keep the channels clear. She looked at the almanac margin note she had read weeks ago, the one she had not fully understood until now. If spring floods, check east wall drainage port, clear debris. Her grandfather had known. He had anticipated this exact problem, this exact moment, and he had left her the instructions to fix it. She stood and wiped her hands on her coat and walked to the hearth. The fire had gone out during the night and the chamber was cold. She rebuilt it, stacking kindling and lighting it with a match from the oilcloth box, feeding it carefully until the flames caught and the warmth began to spread. Then she sat at the table and opened the almanac and read the note again. Everything he had built, every system, every detail had been thought through. He had lived here, worked here, learned the patterns of water and stone and season, and he had encoded that knowledge into the structure of the refuge itself. She was not just inheriting land. She was inheriting understanding. The storm passed by morning, leaving the valley soaked and the creek running high. Willa climbed to the surface and stood in the cold dawn light and surveyed the damage. The yard was a sea of mud. The collapsed outbuilding had settled further into the ground. The barn stood, but water dripped from the gaps in the roof where the planks had pulled away. She walked to the creek and saw that the water level had risen significantly, spilling over the banks, in places flooding the low ground where she had planned to plant. But along the bank where the flood had washed away the topsoil, something had been exposed. She knelt and looked closer. It was a seam of clay, deep red-brown, running along the creek bed for several yards. She scooped up a handful and worked it between her fingers. It was dense and smooth, the kind of clay that could be shaped and fired, the kind of clay that had value. She made a note of it and moved on. Further along the creek, she found wild berry bushes. She had not noticed before, their branches bare now, but marked with the small scars, where fruit would grow in summer. The storm had revealed things the land had been hiding. Resources she had not known were there. She was making her way back to the barn when she heard voices. Tobias Brennan appeared at the edge of the property, walking toward her, with his daughter Mabel at his side. They were both wrapped in heavy coats, and Tobias carried a canvas sack over one shoulder. "Came to check on you," Tobias said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. "That was a hard storm. Wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," Willa said. The refuge held. Tobias looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You stayed underground through the whole thing?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Smart. That's what your grandfather would have done." Mabel was looking around the yard, taking in the mud and the flooded creek and the exposed clay seam with the sharp attention of someone who missed very little. "There's something under the yard, isn't there?" Mabel said, and it was not quite a question. Willa glanced at Tobias, who shrugged slightly. "She's perceptive," he said. "There is," Willa said, looking at Mabel. "I'll show you sometime if your father allows." Mabel's face lit up, but she said nothing, waiting for her father's permission. Tobias smiled behind his beard. "We'll see." He set down the canvas sack. "Brought you some supplies. Flour, salt, a bit of dried meat. Figured you might be running low." "You didn't have to do that," Willa said. "I know," Tobias said, "but your grandfather was a good neighbor to me for 25 years. I owe him that much. And I owe you a barn repair, which I'm here to do if you're ready." Willa looked at him, at the steady seriousness of his expression, at the canvas sack, and the tools strapped to his belt. "I'm ready," she said. They worked through the afternoon, the three of them, Tobias and Willa on the roof and Mabel on the ground, handing up tools and holding the ladder steady. Tobias was a craftsman. Willa saw that immediately. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work his entire life, measuring twice, cutting once, fitting the boards with a precision that left no gaps. He taught as he worked, explaining the logic of the construction, showing Willa how to read the grain of the wood, how to angle the nails so they would hold without splitting the plank, how to check for level and plumb. Willa listened and learned and followed his lead, and by the time the sun was low in the sky, the corner was repaired and the two sprung planks were re-nailed, and the barn felt, if not new, like something that intended to stand through another winter. They climbed down and stood in the yard, looking up at the work. "Your grandfather built this barn to last," Tobias said. "It just needed someone to care for it. You did good work today." "You did the work," Willa said. "I held the boards," Tobias said. "You nailed them. That's the part that counts." Mabel brought them water from the well, and they drank it standing in the cold, watching the last light fade from the valley. "You handled that storm yourself," Tobias said after a while. "Fixed the drainage, kept the refuge intact. That's not nothing." "I read the instructions," Willa said. "Most people wouldn't have known where to look." Tobias set down the cup. "Your grandfather was an engineer. Did you know that—" "I'm learning," Willa said. "He worked for the railroad before he came here. Surveyed half of Montana. He knew how to build things that lasted." Tobias looked at the barn, then at the well, then at the valley walls. "He knew this land better than anyone, and he built all of this for you." Willa did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They left as the stars appeared. Tobias and Mabel walking back toward their own property in the growing dark. Willa watched them go, then descended to the refuge and lit the hearth and sat at the table with the almanac. She opened it to the back pages where there was blank space, and she picked up the pencil stub her grandfather had left. "February 16th, she wrote. "Storm passed. Drainage cleared. Barn repaired with help from Tobias Brennan. Clay seam exposed along creek. Berry bushes found. Rye planted February 9th. Watching for sprouts." She set down the pencil and looked at the words. This was how it started. This was how her grandfather had done it. One day at a time, one observation at a time, one small accumulation of knowledge building into something larger. She closed the almanac and banked the fire and went to sleep in the small cabin with the sound of the spring running in the darkness. She had survived the storm. She had fixed the barn. She had planted the rye. She was beginning to understand what it meant to earn a place. The days after the storm settled into a pattern that felt less like routine and more like education. Willa rose before dawn, worked the mornings at Tobias Brennan's feed operation, and spent the afternoons at the Valley Farm, learning the land the way a person learns a language, slowly through immersion and repetition, and the steady accumulation of small understandings. The rye she had planted began to show itself on the 26th of February. She noticed the first green shoots when she walked the creek bank in the late afternoon. Tiny pale blades pushing up through the dark soil. So small she almost missed them. She knelt and touched one with her finger, feeling the delicate strength of it, the improbable fact of it. She had put seeds in cold ground, and the ground had given them back as life. It was not much. It was everything. She walked the rows, carefully counting the shoots, noting where they were thickest, and where they were sparse, making mental calculations about yield and timing and what she would need to do next. The almanac said rye would tolerate frost, but it also said to watch for late snow, which could bury the young plants and slow their growth. She made a note to check the field every morning to track the progress, to learn the rhythm of growth. This was the work her grandfather had done. This was the patient attention that had built the refuge and stocked the shelves and left her the foundation to stand on. She could do this. She was doing this. But the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the storm, the question she had been avoiding, finally demanded an answer. The metal box. It sat on the high shelf in the refuge, locked and heavy and full of something her grandfather had wanted secured. She had tried to open it twice in the weeks since she had found it, and both times the lock had held. She had searched the refuge thoroughly, looking for a key. She had checked the shelves, the hearth, the cabin, the tool rack. She had run her hands along the limestone walls, feeling for hidden hollows or carved niches. She had found nothing, but her grandfather had left instructions for everything else. The drainage, the planting, the maintenance of the systems he had built. He would not have locked the box without leaving a way to open it. She sat at the table one evening with the almanac open in front of her, reading through the margin notes again, looking for any hint, any clue she might have missed. Most of the notes were practical. Planting dates, weather observations, soil conditions. But there were a few that seemed more personal notes that felt like they were meant for her specifically, rather than for any general reader. On page 47, tucked into a paragraph about spring flooding, she found a line written in lighter pencil, almost faded. Box key. Where water meets stone. She read it 3 times, making sure she had not imagined it. Where water meets stone. She stood and walked to the spring channel, to the place where the water emerged from the crack in the limestone wall. This was where water met stone literally. The spring source. She knelt beside the channel and ran her hand along the rock face, feeling for anything unusual. The limestone was rough and uneven, shaped by years of water flow. But there were no obvious hollows, no carved spaces. She moved closer to the source, to the narrow crack where the water emerged. The opening was small, barely wide enough to fit her hand, and the water was cold enough to numb her fingers within seconds. She felt along the edges of the crack, working her way deeper, ignoring the cold, focusing on the texture of the stone. And then she felt it, a small carved hollow just behind the water flow, barely large enough to hold her fingertips. She reached in carefully and felt something hard and metallic. She pulled it out. A brass key, small and simple, with a loop at one end and a notched shaft at the other. It was wet and cold in her hand, and it was exactly what she had been looking for. She dried it on her coat and walked to the high shelf. She took down the metal box and set it on the table. Her hands were not quite steady. The key fit perfectly. The lock turned with a soft click. She opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were several items. She lifted them out one at a time and set them on the table. First, a thick sheaf of papers folded and tied with string. She untied them and spread them out. Legal documents. The original land grant deed dated 1843. Transferring 40 acres in Black Pine Valley from the territorial government to one Silas Ashford. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the ink was still clear. Second, a certified copy of her grandfather's will naming her as sole heir. It was dated 6 months before his death, properly witnessed and notarized. Third, a small leather-bound book. She opened it and saw her grandfather's handwriting, dense and cramped, filling page after page. A journal. Fourth, a bank book from a bank in Butte showing an account in her grandfather's name with a balance of $340. And fifth, at the bottom of the box, 2 photographs. The first showed a young man, perhaps 30 years old, standing with a group of other men in front of a surveyor's transit. The men wore work clothes and serious expressions, and behind them stretched a vast empty landscape of grass and sky. Her grandfather, she realized. Young, strong, standing at the beginning of his life. The second photograph showed the same man, older now, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Standing beside him was a woman in a simple dress, smiling slightly, one hand on the man's shoulder. The baby was her mother, Willa understood. The woman was her grandmother. And the man was Silas, holding his family years before Willa was born. She set the photographs down carefully and picked up the journal. It was heavy in her hands, filled with years of entries, observations, calculations. She opened it to the first page and read, April 18th, 1843. Purchased 40 acres in Black Pine Valley. Paid cash $28. The land is remote, but the survey work I did last season showed good water and soil. I believe it can support a family if the family is willing to work. She turned the pages, slowly reading entries at random, getting a sense of the arc of her grandfather's life. 1845. Built the barn. Took 3 months. Had to haul every board from the mill in Deaver. The work was hard, but the structure is sound. It will stand for 100 years if it is maintained. 1846. Found the spring while digging a root cellar. Went deeper than planned and broke through to an underground source. The water is clear and cold and constant. I have decided to build a refuge around it. 1847. The refuge chamber is complete. 20 feet across, 8 feet high at the center. The work took 7 years of winters. I am pleased with it. She read on, watching the years accumulate, watching her grandfather's vision take shape, page by page. 1863. Stocked the first shelves. Began with grain and tools. I am building this for the future, for someone who will need it. 1864. The hearth is installed. The flue runs up through the valley wall and emerges disguised as natural stone. No one will find it unless they know where to look. 1865. I am 71 years old. My body is slowing, but the refuge is nearly complete. I have left instructions in the almanac for planting and maintenance. I hope whoever finds this will understand what I have tried to do. And then on the last page, dated December of 1883, just weeks before his death, Willa will come. She has my eyes. She sees what others miss. She has patience learned from my letters. The refuge is her foundation. What she builds on it is her choice. I have given her the tools. She must earn the respect. Willa closed the journal and sat very still. Her grandfather had not been a farmer when he came to the valley. He had been a surveyor, a man who understood land and water, and the engineering principles that govern both. He had chosen this place deliberately, not because it was easy, but because he saw what it could be. And he had spent 40 years proving himself right. She looked at the bank book again. $340. It was not a fortune, but it was more than she had expected, more than she had ever had at one time in her life. It was enough to pay taxes, enough to buy seed for next year, enough to give her a margin of safety if the first harvest failed. Her grandfather had thought of everything. She put the documents back in the box carefully and locked it again. Then she took the journal and the photographs and set them on the shelf above her bed in the small cabin. These were her inheritance. Not just the land, not just the refuge, but the knowledge her grandfather had accumulated over a lifetime. The understanding of this place encoded in journal entries and margin notes, and the physical structure of everything he had built. She was not starting from nothing. She was starting from 40 years of deliberate preparation. The next morning, she walked to Tobias Brennan's feed operation and told him she would be working half days from now on. The barn was repaired and she needed to focus on the farm full time. Tobias nodded. "You've earned that. But if you need work again, the offer stands." "Thank you," Willa said. She spent the rest of February and all of March preparing. She worked the soil in the yard, breaking up the frost-hardened ground with a hoe and a spade, turning it over, making it ready for planting. She cleared the debris from the collapsed outbuilding and sorted through it for salvageable materials. She walked the property every day, learning its contours, noting where the sun hit in the morning and where the shade lasted longest in the afternoon. She marked the locations of the clay seam and the berry bushes and made plans for how to use them. She read the journal every evening, absorbing her grandfather's observations about the valley, about the seasons, about the work of building a life in a place that did not give up its secrets easily. And she watched the rye grow. By mid-March, the shoots were 4 inches tall, bright green against the dark soil, standing in neat rows along the creek bank. By the end of March, they were 8 inches thick and healthy, swaying slightly in the wind. She had done that. She had put seeds in the ground and tended them and watched them become something real. It was a small victory, but it was hers. On the 7th of April, a man arrived at the farm riding a bay horse and carrying a leather satchel. He introduced himself as Fletcher Hastings, county assessor, and he had come, he said, to discuss the property status. Willa met him in the yard, standing beside the well, and she knew before he spoke what this was about. "Miss Ashford," Fletcher said, dismounting. He was a man in his late 40s, lean and serious, with the kind of face that suggested he took his work seriously and expected others to do the same. "I'm here on county business. May I have a few minutes of your time?" "Of course," Willa said. Fletcher pulled a document from his satchel and unfolded it. "This property has been recorded as abandoned for more than 10 years. Under Montana territorial law, land that is not actively used for agricultural purposes can be reclaimed by the county and sold at public auction to recover unpaid taxes." Willa said nothing. She had expected this or something like it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that anticipation had not. "I'm here to inform you," Fletcher continued, "that you have 90 days from today to demonstrate active agricultural use of this property. That means planted crops, maintained structures, and evidence of permanent residence. If you cannot meet those requirements, the property will be subject to reclamation proceedings." He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but not sympathetic either. It was the expression of someone doing a job that required fairness rather than mercy. 90 days, he said. "That brings us to the 8th of May. I'll return then to conduct an inspection. If the property meets the requirements, your claim will be confirmed. If not, the county will proceed with reclamation." "I understand," Willa said. Fletcher folded the document and put it back in his satchel. "Miss Ashford, I'll be frank with you. I've seen a lot of young people try to claim land they're not prepared to work. Most of them give up within a month. You seem determined, and I respect that. But determination isn't enough. You'll need equipment, livestock knowledge, and help. Do you have those things?" "I'm learning," Willa said. Fletcher looked at the rye field, at the repaired barn, at the cleared yard. "You've made a start, but a start isn't the same as success. 90 days goes by faster than you think." "I'll be ready," Willa said. Fletcher nodded. "I hope so. The county needs productive land, not auctions. But the law is the law, and I enforce it without favor." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Willa standing in the yard with the weight of a deadline pressing down on her. 90 days. She had until the 8th of May to prove she belonged here. The days that followed were the hardest Willa had ever worked. She planted turnips in the corner of the yard, nearest the well, following the almanac's instructions about spacing and depth. She cleared the berry bushes along the creek and marked them for summer harvest. She documented the clay seam with careful notes, collecting samples and storing them in labeled crocks. She worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to eat and sleep, driving herself with the knowledge that every day that passed was one day closer to the inspection. Tobias came by twice to check on her, and both times he offered help, and both times she accepted. He showed her how to build a simple fence from salvaged wood, how to repair the milking stool with a cracked leg, how to properly sharpen the tools so they would hold an edge. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said one afternoon, watching her dig post holes for the fence. "You'll burn out before the inspection." "I don't have a choice," Willa said. "Everyone has a choice," Tobias said. "You're choosing to do this the hard way." "It's the only way I know," Willa said. He smiled slightly. "Your grandfather said the same thing." By late April, the farm was beginning to look like a farm. The rye was 2 feet tall, thick and green, waving in the wind. The turnips had sprouted small pale shoots in the dark soil. The fence was up, enclosing a small section of the yard that could eventually hold livestock. The barn was clean and functional, the tools organized and maintained. The yard was cleared of debris, the paths marked and defined, and Willa herself had changed. She was thinner, harder, her hands calloused and strong, her shoulders broader from the work. She moved with a confidence she had not possessed when she arrived, a certainty that came from knowing what she was capable of. She had earned this. Every board, every planted seed, every repaired tool was proof that she could do this. But she did not know if it would be enough. On the 4th of May, 4 days before the deadline, Fletcher Hastings returned. Willa saw him coming from a distance, riding the same bay horse, carrying the same leather satchel. She met him at the edge of the property, standing straight ready. "Miss Ashford," Fletcher said, dismounting. "I'm here for the inspection." "I'm ready," Willa said. Fletcher pulled a clipboard from his satchel and a pencil. "Show me what you've done." She walked him through the property, pointing out each improvement, each planted crop, each maintained structure. She showed him the rye field, now 3 feet tall and beginning to form seed heads. She showed him the turnips, small but healthy. She showed him the fence, the repaired barn, the cleared yard. She showed him the spring at the well, the constant flow of water that proved the land was not dry or worthless. She showed him the clay seam along the creek, the berry bushes that marked timber trail into the fir forest. And she showed him the refuge entrance, the stone slab that covered the passage to the underground chamber. Fletcher looked at it for a long time without speaking. "May I see inside?" he asked. Willa hesitated. The refuge was private, personal, the heart of everything her grandfather had built. But this was an inspection, and she had nothing to hide. "Yes," she said. She lifted the slab and descended the stone steps, and Fletcher followed. The lantern light filled the chamber, illuminating the shelves and the hearth and the spring channel, and the small cabin in the corner. Fletcher stood at the entrance, looking around slowly, taking it all in. "How long has this been here?" he asked. 40 years, Willa said. "My grandfather built it." Fletcher walked to the shelves and read the labels on the crocks, the dates, the careful handwriting. He examined the hearth and the flue pipe. He knelt beside the spring channel and watched the water flow. "This is remarkable," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." "My grandfather was an engineer," Willa said. "He knew how to build things that lasted." Fletcher stood and looked at her. "And you've maintained all of this alone?" "Yes," Willa said. He made notes on his clipboard, writing quickly, his expression unreadable. They climbed back to the surface, and Fletcher walked the property again, this time in silence, measuring distances with his eyes, noting details Willa had not pointed out. Finally, he stopped in the center of the yard and turned to face her. "Miss Ashford," he said, "when I came here in April, I didn't think you'd make it. I thought you'd plant a few seeds. Realized the work was too hard and give up. I've seen it happen a dozen times." He looked at the rye field, at the barn, at the cleared yard. "But you didn't give up. You did the work. You planted crops, you repaired structures, you established residents. You've documented resources I didn't know existed. You've exceeded the minimum requirements for agricultural use." He made a final note on the clipboard and looked at her directly. "I'll recommend approval to the county board. Your claim will be confirmed." Willa felt something inside her chest loosen a tension she had been carrying for so long. She had forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said. Fletcher tucked the clipboard into his satchel. "Don't thank me. You did this. I'm just recording it." He paused. "I admit I was wrong about you. I thought a girl your age alone with no experience would fail. But you proved me wrong. Your grandfather would be proud." "I hope so," Willa said. Fletcher mounted his horse. "The county board meets on the 8th. You'll receive official confirmation within the week." He rode away, and Willa stood in the yard and watched him go. She had done it. She had met the deadline. She had proven active agricultural use. The land was hers. That evening, she sat in the refuge at the small table with the almanac open in front of her and a pencil in her hand. May 4th, 1884, she wrote. "County inspection completed. Property claim approved. Rye planted February 9th, now 3 feet tall. Seed heads forming. Turnips planted April 2nd, sprouting well. Barn repaired, fence built, spring documented. I have earned this." She set down the pencil and looked at the words. Her grandfather had written in this almanac for years, recording his observations, his failures, his small successes. Now she was adding her own entries, continuing the record building on what he had started. This was how knowledge was passed, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through careful notes in the margins of old books, through quiet accumulation, through the patient work of one generation, preparing the ground for the next. On the 8th of May, the county board confirmed her claim. The notice arrived by mail, a single sheet of paper with an official seal, stating that the property at Black Pine Valley was recorded in the name of Willa Ashford, free and clear, subject to annual taxes. She read the notice 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the metal box with the other documents. It was done. The land was legally hers. No one could take it from her now, but the work was not finished. It would never be finished. A farm was not something you completed and walked away from. It was something you tended continuously, season after season, year after year. She had learned that from her grandfather, from the 40 years he had spent building the refuge, from the decades of notes in the almanac, from the careful planning that had gone into every shelf and every drainage channel and every instruction he had left. This was not a destination. It was a beginning. The rye matured in late May, the seed heads turning from green to gold, heavy with grain. Willa harvested it in early June, cutting the stalks with a sickle she found in the barn, bundling them and hanging them to dry. It was not a large harvest. The field she had planted was small, barely a 1/4 acre. But the yield was good, better than she had expected. And when she threshed the grain and measured it, she had enough to feed herself through the summer, and enough to replant next year with seed left over to sell. It was a beginning. The turnips came up in mid-June, small and sweet, more than she could eat alone. She stored them in crocks in the refuge and traded some to Tobias for chicken feed and nails and other small necessities. The clay seam along the creek turned out to be valuable. Tobias knew a potter in Deaver who was willing to pay for quality clay, and Willa dug samples and sold them, adding to the small reserve of money she had been building. The berry bushes produced fruit in July more than she could use. She made preserves following a recipe she found in her grandmother's handwriting on a scrap of paper, tucked into the almanac, and stored them on the shelves in the refuge. The farm was beginning to sustain her, not easily, not abundantly, but steadily, reliably, the way her grandfather had intended. And the town noticed. The talk in Silver Creek shifted gradually from skepticism to cautious acknowledgement. The Ashford girl had made it through the inspection. The Ashford girl had planted crops and harvested them. The Ashford girl had, against all expectations, proven that the valley land was not worthless after all. Customers at Tobias's feed store asked about her, asked for advice on hardy rye and cold-tolerant crops. Other valley farmers stopped by the property, curious about the clay seam in the spring and the methods she was using. Willa answered their questions politely, showed them what she had learned, shared the knowledge her grandfather had left in the almanac margins. She did not gloat. She did not claim to know more than she did. She simply showed them what worked and let the results speak for themselves. Mrs. Pruitt sent a short note in late June, delivered by the mail coach. It said only, "I misjudged you. I was wrong. Good luck." Willa folded the note and put it in the metal box with the other documents. It was not an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, and that was enough. Tobias Brennan became a regular visitor, stopping by once a week to check on her progress, to offer advice, to share news from the valley. His daughter Mabel came with him, sometimes fascinated by the refuge, by the engineering of the spring channel, and the hidden hearth chimney. "Your grandfather was a genius," Mabel said one afternoon, sitting in the refuge chamber watching the water flow through the channel. "He built all of this in secret, and no one ever knew." "He was patient," Willa said. "That's what made it possible." Tobias stood at the entrance, looking at the shelves, at the carefully labeled crocks and tins. "He built this for you," he said. "He knew you'd need it, and he made sure it was ready." "He gave me a foundation," Willa said. "I have to build the rest myself." "You're doing it," Tobias said. By late summer, the farm had settled into a rhythm. Willa worked the land, tended the crops, maintained the structures. She sold surplus grain and clay and preserves, adding to her savings, preparing for winter. She spent her evenings in the refuge reading the journal, adding her own notes to the almanac, learning the patterns of the valley through observation and experience. She was not rich. She was not comfortable. But she was self-sufficient. And she was standing on ground that was hers, legally and morally earned through work and patience, and the application of knowledge her grandfather had spent a lifetime accumulating. She had proven the skeptics wrong. She had met the deadline. She had turned 40 acres of supposedly worthless land into something productive and valuable. But more than that, she had learned what it meant to belong to a place. Not to own it exactly, but to understand it, to know its rhythms and its secrets, to be part of its ongoing story. Her grandfather had done that. He had spent 40 years learning this valley, and he had encoded that learning into everything he built, every margin note, every careful instruction. Now she was continuing that work. Not because she had to, but because it was worth doing. One evening in late August, Willa sat at the well as the sun set behind the valley wall. She pulled up a bucket of cold spring water and drank from it, tasting the stone and the depth. She looked across the 40 acres, the rye field now harvested and empty, waiting for next year's planting, the turnip patch green and thriving, the barn solid and weatherproof, the fence straight and functional, and beneath her feet, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look, the refuge, the hearth and the shelves and the spring channel, the 40 years of patient work, the accumulated wisdom, the foundation her grandfather had built. She thought about the letters he had sent her over the years. "Keep your eyes open, Willa girl. The world hides more than it shows." She understood now. He had not been talking about secrets or mysteries. He had been talking about value that was not obvious, about worth that had to be discovered through attention and effort. The valley land had always been valuable. It had good water, good soil, timber, clay, wild berries. But you had to look carefully to see it. You had to be patient enough to learn it. You had to be willing to do the work. Her grandfather had done that work. He had looked carefully, learned patiently, worked deliberately, and he had left her the tools to continue. She descended to the refuge as the stars appeared overhead. She lit the hearth, cooked a simple meal, sat at the table with the almanac. She opened it to the blank pages at the back and picked up the pencil. August 23rd, 1884. First harvest complete. Rye yield exceeded expectations. Turnips thriving. Clay sold to potter in Deaver. berry preserves stored for winter, have saved enough for taxes and seed for next year. The land is sustaining me. I am learning its patterns. I am beginning to understand what my grandfather knew. She set down the pencil and looked at the words. This was her life now. Not a departure from something, but an arrival at something. A place she had earned through competence and patience, and the application of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. She closed the almanac and banked the fire, and went to sleep in the small cabin listening to the spring run its quiet course through the darkness. In the morning she would climb to the surface and begin again. There would be work to do, always work, the endless patient labor of maintaining a farm and a life. But it was her work, her land, her place. And she was not asking the world for it anymore. She was standing in it,